Welcome to our Good Friday service. As we start this evening, I want to remind you of the water image we used yesterday. Remember that image of water? That in creation, God took the chaos of water and made life out of it. Apple trees and plum trees, and hemlock and redwood, trees and vegetables and flowers of all endless varieties. Water, it says in Genesis, the waters were teeming with fish of all kinds. Land was dancing with zebras and donkeys and monkeys and spotted owls and giraffes as tall as the trees. Grace upon grace abounded. And how Jesus just wanted to pour that unlimited grace into the world, onto the world, especially onto the ones who didn't seem to be getting any. The sick, the poor, the lepers, the woman at the well, the least of these. For God so loved the world. Come all ye weary, come all you thirsty, come to the well that never runs dry. Drink of the water, come and thirst no more. For God so loved the world that God gave us this one and only Son to save us. Whoever so lives in this love will live forever. For God so loved the world that God gave us this one and only Son to save us. Whoever so lives in this love will live forever. Jesus wanted to pour that grace, right? All over. That unlimited and unconditional love upside down and pour it out into the world. But I also want to remind you of that piñata. Do you remember that? Do you remember what that symbolized? The piñata was God's grace, heaven. And the stick that cracks open that heaven was Jesus. A strange image in a way, but Jesus' whole life was about breaking that piñata open, cracking open heaven so that God's grace wasn't something we had to pay for, but instead would come pouring out to the world so that we could just open our hearts and receive it. Well, that's one way maybe to understand Jesus' ministry. But in order to fully understand what was going on, you need to know that there were some folks who wanted to keep that grace, that vessel to themselves, to control it as if it were not a limitless resource, but a limited resource. Take the temple tax system, for instance. You couldn't just receive forgiveness freely in the system. You had to buy a sacrificially clean animal blessed by the temple priests, and you could only get one of them by buying it here at the temple. This was the table where you did that. This is how the temple made their money. This is how the temple padded the coffers for the temple priests. In this system, it was almost like the priests owned God's grace, or thought they did. And you could only get it through them. And how did Jesus respond to this temple tax system? To that system that was trying to hold God's grace for themselves and prevent it from pouring out to all. Well, Jesus was outraged. He just tore into it, and he just turned the tables over. He could not stand that idea. And that started the serious wheels turning. That started the dark process in which the temple priests and the Pharisees looked for a serious opportunity to kill Jesus. It was then that they started to make inroads into the band of followers that followed this Jesus. It was then that they found a weak heart in that group Judas, frustrated and impatient with Jesus' reluctance to go to battle, and in need, of course, of what we all want, cold cash, 30 pieces of silver. Judas was their man. And so the game begins. Jesus trying to break open the systems that held God's grace back from pouring out onto all God's people, and the chief priests and the Roman authorities trying to keep on top of the game they had going, trying to hold back the grace. And in the end, it seems at least from a worldly understanding that actually it turns out that Jesus is the one that becomes the piñata, struck by the world's sticks and stones and whips and spit. Jesus became the object, not stringing up on a string, but on that cross. And as Roman soldiers mocked him and beat him and scourged him over and over again, they placed a sarcastic sign on the cross, King of the Jews, and placed crown of thorns on his head. They were sure they could kill this movement, this grace, and hold it back and keep it for themselves and keep it where it belonged. But for some in the crowd, they saw something more, something deeper. They saw a terrible beauty laid out before them, a love that refused to die. Jesus for them became the grace of God, God's self, a symbol for what God was willing to go through just to show us how much God loved this world. They saw Jesus almost a living vessel of life-giving water who kept emptying himself for everything worldly until all that was left up there on the cross was pure, unbounded love. God, Jesus dying on the cross, being whipped and spit on, became the symbol of a love that would not give up, that kept giving and giving, even unto death. Every whack he took from the soldiers, every pompous look he received from those temple priests became not a symbol of disgust, but a badge instead of this new understanding of love, a sacrificial love. And so the whole world watched as this Jesus, this symbol of God's unconditional love, freely given, battled it out with this world so intent on holding and controlling it all. And it seemed that the whole fate of the world was held in balance. All of us waiting for the outcome. And the strange thing was that the more Jesus took, the more blows he took. You'd think the more the crowd would have been shouting even louder, "Crucify him, crucify him." But instead, it seemed that the more blows Jesus took, the quieter the crowd got. The more they backed away. It's almost as if the crowd began to realize their part in all of this. Almost as if the crowd became Peter and realized how many times they had denied this truth, this grace. It's almost as if the crowd became Judas and wondered how many acts of love they had passed up for just a mere 30 pieces of silver. How much love they could have given to someone else. How many times they had taken an opportunity to give this grace to others and smashed it on the ground because of their own selfish gain. Until when finally Jesus took his final breath and shouted, "Eli, Eli, sabachthani," my God, why have you forsaken me?" The world, who probably should have been cheering, was instead silent. The scriptures say that the whole world went dark for 3 hours. And in those 3 hours, it's almost as if God took one of those chunks of the broken world, one of those pieces of that broken vessel, and made it into a mirror on the cross. And the world, for one of the first times in history, saw what it was doing. that the world had realized that they had killed, struck down, destroyed the most beautiful symbol and gift of grace they had ever known.
Love is this that calls the Lord of bliss to bear the dreadful curse for my soul, to bear the dreadful curse for my soul.
And upon realizing this, the disciples scatter like sheep, like pieces of that jar. But who stays? Witnessed by some of the women from a distance, a Roman soldier. Some wonder, could this same Roman soldier have been one scourging Jesus on the back, a part of breaking the piñata open? Someone who now only watched Jesus' blood spill, but maybe had some of it on his own hands. This Roman soldier goes up to the cross and kneels and says, "This truly is the Son of God." The least likely person in the world to look in the mirror and see who Jesus really is the first to kneel and proclaim this crucified Jesus as Lord and light of the world. The first shall be last, the least and the last shall go first. God had given a beautiful and precious vessel of God's grace, and the world had taken that vase and crashed it onto the ground and smashed it and kicked it and spat on it. And so as you hear the story of the cross, may you also witness that pain of our Jesus getting tossed around like a piñata. It's never fun, but maybe, just maybe, it will become a mirror for you, so that you can see the pain you sometimes cause. May it also, though, give you eyes to see that right in the middle of all this pain, there are moments where Christ leaves not drops of blood on the way to the cross, but drops of love and hope. And maybe, just maybe, your heart will stop for just a moment, and you will feel this strong, compelling tug at your heart, and you will choose to bend at the cross like that soldier. Come join the story of the cross. And as we tell this story, we'll pause along the way and place a fragment of this vessel of grace, broken as it is, onto the cross, in the hopes that we may see the power we have, both good and bad, in this world we live.
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree?
Our story begins in a small upper room. Jesus was gathered there with his closest disciples, and they were gathered there to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Passover, men and women, those closest around Jesus. And as Jesus took the bread and the cup of L'chaim, he reimagined that meal. The bread became his body, and the cup his blood. And he shared with the disciples the sad news that this might be the last night with them. And as he offered them this meal, he shared with them that each of them would scatter like sheep. They all denied it. Peter perhaps most boldly. But as Jesus served each of them with the bread and the wine, came also an offer of forgiveness and a plea by Jesus for the disciples to remember this meal and this forgiveness and this love every time they got together to eat. And just as this beautiful act of love and forgiveness is being played out, Judas, one of the 12, slips out and finds the high priest of the temple. And for 30 pieces of silver, it doesn't look like much, does it? He shares with them that Jesus will be in the garden soon, and that would be the perfect place for quiet arrest. And so the journey begins. Money. It's such an interesting instrument. It can be used to give people freedom, opportunities like education, or it can be used to destroy and belittle. As the seventh child of 8, there was absolutely no way my family could have afforded to send me to college. But through each of your gifts to the government in the form of taxes, and through the church in the form of United Methodist scholarships, and through a Christian family in the Dakotas called the Hattershites, I was given grants and scholarships that gave me that gift. You gave me that gift to learn and grow. I'll never forget it. Money given can be such a blessing for someone else, a beautiful gift. But money can also be used to keep people in place, to build walls, both physical and legal, that keep people out. Study the history of Seattle, I dare you, and you will learn that some of the money that was used to prevent black people from owning houses came from our governments. And many of those housing districts in Seattle were exclusively white. How do you use money? How do we use money?
Holy Jesus, how hast thou offended that we to judge thee have in hate pretended, by foes derided, by thine own rejected, O most afflicted. Who was the guilty? Who brought this upon thee? Alas, my treason, Jesus hath undone thee. 'Twas I, Lord Jesus, I was denied thee. I crucified thee.
After the meal, Jesus and the disciples, they headed to the garden, a special place of prayer for Jesus. And there at the Garden of Gethsemane, we see one of the most touching moments in Jesus' life. Jesus is in the garden on his knees praying, pleading with with God, to let him out of this situation, bargaining with God, just like we all do, trying to persuade God to help him escape this plight of the cross. Send 10,000 angels now, God. I don't care how you do it, just do it. But in the end, Jesus lets go and places his destiny in the hands of God. Your will, not mine, be done. Some of the hardest decisions in my life have been around the issue of holding and letting go. When is it time to let your child go? And when is it time to keep him or her for a couple more years? When is it time to let go of the abuse and neglect of another? Is it wise to keep holding on to this anger? What part of your life do you need to quit trying to control and instead give it over to the hands of God? How many people are you hurting by trying to control their lives too tightly? I met a woman once who was battling uterine cancer, and for 2 years she was completely miserable. And then one day she came to church and just seemed to be at peace, and I asked her what had happened to her. I let go, Pastor Brooke. I know it sounds simple, but I took that resentment and anger and literally said, not my will, but yours. While Jesus was praying, he had set 3 of his disciples at the foot of the garden to watch for Roman guards who were out to get him. Several times during his prayer, Jesus found them to be asleep. Indeed, when he finished praying, they were there a 3rd time, fast asleep. And just as Jesus woke them, the Roman guards had arrived to arrest them. How many times have you fallen asleep on the watch? Who have you been charged by God to keep? In the book of Genesis, Cain shouts out at God, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Are you? And how are you doing in keeping watch over God's most precious sheep? Some of my favorite people are foster parents and adoptive parents. To adopt a child, I think, is one of the most incredible acts of faith I've ever known. These folks are people who've truly taken up the call to take care of Jesus' sheep. To know that several of our members here at Bear Creek have done that is so heartwarming to me. I know I'm in good company. My hat's off to the incredible commitment of Dee and Tom McMillan and Bill and Karen Robinson. That faith and love, that inspires me. And yet there are still troubling signs in our world where the question of just who our children and brothers or sisters seems to be going unanswered. Are the children from Honduras and Central America down on our borders our brothers and sisters? God's sheep? What's our responsibility to them? Are the children in our schools who are called to participate in shooting drills brothers and sisters? Jesus' sheep? How should we be keeping watch over them?
We sing for our brothers, we sing for our sons, we sing for their freedom, we sing for the change we believe's gonna come. We sing for their freedom, We sing 'cause things are not the way they should be. We sing for their freedom, and we won't stop singing until we are free. We sing for their freedom. We march for our mothers, our sisters and kin. Queremos justicia. We fight for the victories we know you will win. Queremos justicia. We cry for our families. We cry for our friends. Come, Lord Jesus, and we sing for the hope that you're coming again. Come, Lord Jesus, we sing for their freedom. Queremos justicia.
As the Roman soldiers approach, Judas appears. He's arranged a special sign to help the soldiers identify Jesus, the one he kisses on the cheek. And so Judas runs up and kisses Jesus, and the Roman soldiers arrest him. Many scholars believe that Judas was hoping that this act would force Jesus into action, to fight back, and therefore start a military coup. Peter seems ready. He draws his sword and cuts off the ear of a Roman soldier. But Jesus stops him, rebukes him, and takes the ear of the soldier, puts it back on, and heals him. It was then that Judas ran back to the chief priests and tried to give the pieces of silver back. But they mocked him and refused. And it was then that he ran off and hung himself in despair. For me, this is one of the most tragic moments in the life of the disciples. In any Testament's era, to be honest, too many people in our world choose to take the greatest gift they have, themselves, and destroy it. Too many people don't know how precious they are. Depression and loneliness run rampant in our world. One of God's greatest instruments of connection in this world is us, the church. The church is God's great invitation card to the world. The church is God's great weapon against the atrocities of loneliness. Are we being God's instrument? Who have you invited into God's grace recently? Your invite can be a life-defining moment for someone. After being arrested, Jesus went first to the Jewish temple courts, where he was to be tried by the high priest of the temple. It's important here to understand this. Jesus was really tried twice. First in the Jewish temple courts, and later by Pilate and the Roman authorities. Upon being arrested by the Jewish authorities, Jesus would have been lowered into a holding cell and kept there until the trial. Now Peter, who loved Jesus dearly, follows him there. Sometimes we don't see the beauty in this act of courage. It took guts. Peter risked his life to be there for Jesus. He wants to be there. He understands how important presence is. Outside the courthouse were courtyards, and Peter was hanging out by one of the fires, and a woman started talking to him. And she recognized his accent and asked him if he was a Galilean like this man Jesus. Peter shook his head and found another fire to hang around. But this didn't seem to help, for around that fire a man accused him of the same thing. Peter again denied the accusation, but now, instead of warming himself by the fire, he held back in the shadows. But still, even in the shadows, a third person calls out to him, "Certainly, you must also be with this Galilean named Jesus." And this time, Peter just stands up and denies it. "Man, I do not know what you're talking about." And just then, the rooster crows. One of the most beautiful acts in my life was a funeral. And just moved to a little town, my first full-time parish, and Cindy's mother died right around Easter. We were hit hard by this. I was asked to do the funeral, and I was almost in shock in doing all this. I had so much pain myself. I stood up in the pulpit in front of Cindy's family, and it's a big family, and my knees began to buckle. And then I looked out, and there in the back row were 12 members of that little church I was serving. They drove a long ways. In the presence of those 12 members of my church, that helped me through it. Presence is power. Peter knew that, but he couldn't deliver. Who do you need to be present for? Don't just say it. Be there.
What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? Oh, make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love to thee. Oh, make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love to thee.
After being tried by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court of law, the Jewish authorities take Jesus over to Pilate, the Roman authorities. You see, the Jewish court was really just a puppet court in the end under the Roman authority. The Jews didn't believe in the death penalty, but in this case, they wanted Jesus killed. And in order to have him hung on a cross, they would have to get permission from Pilate, the Roman who ruled over Jerusalem at that time. Jesus put Pilate in a bind. Pilate was called to make peace in Jerusalem. Not an easy task in this time of Passover. There was a tiny needlehead Pilate was constantly trying to thread and keeping things peaceful in Jerusalem, and it almost always had to do with these people called the Jews. The last thing he wanted at this time was an insurrection, for a small band of Jewish insurrectionists to get going and try to hold a coup. So he was always trying to keep the Jewish authorities happy, to throw them a bone. But Pilate had witnessed Jesus' parade the week before. He realized the strange power Jesus had with the people there. To put Jesus to death might just start a riot. Just what Pilate didn't want. And so Pilate, he tries to find a loophole, a little thread he could use to get through the needle. And so he turns to his advisors, and sure enough, they find it. There's a little known tradition that at the Passover, the Roman authorities are given the right to let one prisoner go as a sign of forgiveness. Now, Pilate has his loophole. He doesn't have to lay claim to Jesus. He doesn't have to be the one who takes responsible for killing Jesus or letting him go. And so he goes out to the crowd and he asks them, which do you want to forgive? Jesus, the King of the Jews, or Barabbas? And the crowd, to Pilate's amazement, worked up to a frenzy by the chief priests and the scribes, they asked for Barabbas. They choose an insurrectionist and give up Jesus, the one who taught to turn the other cheek, for crucifixion. Now catch the high irony here. Again, they refuse one of the basic tenets of Jesus' movement, to be peacemakers. Jesus, the peacemaker, is rejected by the crowd. Barabbas, the insurrectionist, the war maker, is let go and accepted by the crowd. Makes you think, doesn't it? How many lives are torn in two by war? It seems sometimes that the history of our people can be described by one endless war, just renamed every decade. And yet when we get to these times of peace, instead of working harder to keep the peace, to make that peace, to actively do the things that make an everlasting peace, we instead sit back and lay in that peace. Which do you do? Which are you? Which Jesus do you choose? The stirring stick of peace, Jesus of Nazareth, or the stirring stick of war, Jesus Barabbas?
Lord, make me an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace. Lord, make me an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is darkness, let me sow light. For in the giving we shall receive, and in the dying we're given life. Where there is sorrow, let me sow hope. Where there is doubt, let me sow faith. Where there is injury, your pardon give, your consolation to those in pain. Oh Lord, make me an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace. Lord, make me an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace.
Before we leave the crowd and our political friend Pilate, let's not forget how this leader chooses to use water. Remember, Jesus chose to pour it on the feet of the poor, to take off his robe of power and kneel and take the towel and wash the feet of the tired and the poor. Well, look how Pilate does things. He uses the water to what? Wash his own hands, to let go of any responsibility. He doesn't want any, and I wonder sometimes, how do we handle water? Do we use it like Jesus does and uses it to empower others and wash the feet of others? Or do we wash our hands of any responsibility we have in this world? Think about it. How do you live? Do you have a responsibility? And are you keeping it?
O sacred neck now wounded, pressed down by blows and knees, the Son of God surrounded by silent enemies, will no one stop and listen? Will no one rise and speak of violence and oppression which hanged you from that tree? O sacred head discounted lies crowned in locks and sweat. See thorns and curls now found in your weeping mother's hands. O sun-kissed King of glory, what honor once was yours, yet now despised and gory, are still and lifeless Lord. O man of sorrows, beaten down, our brother's blood cries from the ground. You bore our sin, we turn our eyes to you, the Lamb of God. O sacred body wounded, now breathless in the street, your people here press onward to be your hands and feet, your mouth to speak your justice, your heart wait for the poor. Your life, it flows within us to break down prison doors. O man of sorrows, beaten down, our brother's blood cries from the ground. You bore our sin, we turn our eyes to you, the Lamb of God. We turn our eyes from you, the Lamb of God.
Now the blows start coming so fast we can hardly count them. After Jesus is sentenced to death, the Roman soldiers take him away, and as they march him through the streets, they find a purple robe, and they take the crown of thorns from a bush and weave it into a crown, and they parade him around and shout, "Hail, King to the Jews!" Again and again they strike him on the head and a staff, and they spit on him, falling on their knees. They pay homage to him, making fun of him, and after whipping him and scourging him, they take off the purple robe and they put on his own clothes again and lead him out to be crucified.
O sacred head now wounded, with grief and shame weighed down, now scornfully surrounded, with thorns thine only crown. O sacred head, what glory, what bliss till now was thine! Yet thou despised and gory, I joy to call thee mine.
But as they march him up the hill called Golgotha, the place of the skulls, there's a very touching moment. As Jesus falls from the weight of carrying the cross and the blood he's lost, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, from Cyrene, an African, is forced to take Jesus' cross and carry it. And the cool thing about this little event is that Simon, most scholars believe anyway, must have been converted to Christianity because of it. Why? Because we know his name. We know where he comes from. He must have been part of the early church. I have participated in many Good Friday services, and in several of these services we have offered folks the opportunity to carry the cross, maybe not one this big, to hold it just as Jesus did. In one of these moments, I think it was on a walk to Emmaus, my walk, we came to this moment, and the first person to volunteer was a homeless man. He hadn't seemed to be much into what we were doing until now, but his eagerness struck us all. And then we watched as this homeless man, who seemed to have zero interest in the story of Christ before this, got on that stage and held that cross in his arms, and he tried to keep it from falling. You saw the will in which he had, the strength in which he exerted, and then we watched as the tears began to flow, and this man, so hardened by the harsh elements of this world, softened and broke, and before our eyes became a Christian, a true follower of Christ. Later, as he shared about that moment and how he felt the weight of all that Jesus was carrying, and realized all the weight he was carrying, and then he heard in his heart that Jesus wanted to carry some of that load with him. I knew then that I was never, ever going to be alone, he said. I didn't have to carry it all myself. Perhaps that's what happened to Simon of Cyrene. What are you carrying? Do you have to carry it alone? Can Jesus help you bear some of your burdens?
I want Jesus to walk with me. I want Jesus to walk with me. All along my pilgrim journey, Lord,
Jesus, our Jesus, is placed on the cross, nailed there. A nail at his hand and one at both of his feet. And there our Jesus hangs to die. It's 9 a.m, and the sign hanging over his head, the King of the Jews. And now it's as if the whole world is against Jesus. Passers-by mock him, shaking their heads. So you who are going to destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself. Chief priests and scribes mocked him by saying, he saved others, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Passerby sticks a sponge up Jesus' nose, try to keep him awake. How awful. On and on and on it goes. How alone it must have felt for Jesus. But what's interesting is he isn't hanging there alone. There, on his left and his right, are 2 thieves hanging with him. One on his left, one on his right, and believe it or not, one of the thieves actually joins in with the crowd in mocking Jesus. Are you the Messiah? Save yourself! But the other thief steps in and defends Jesus. Don't you fear God, he said. Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. Isn't it interesting that the only man in the entire world willing to step in and defend Jesus is a thief hanging on the cross next to him? Jesus doesn't miss this noble act. He turns in his agony and pain and offers this peace, this thief a place in eternity. Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Even in his death, Jesus keeps giving. Who can you give to? It's never too late. Some of the greatest acts of generosity and forgiveness are given at one's last breath.
Calvary's mournful mountain climb, bear adoring at his feet. Mark the miracle of time, God's own sacrifice complete. It is finished, hear the cry. Learn of Jesus Christ to die.
At 12 o'clock, the sun stopped shining. Darkness covered the whole country for 3 hours. And then suddenly there was a shaking of the earth like an earthquake, and that curtain in the temple between the Ark of the Covenant and the people, that curtain that kept all of the have-nots from the holy manna, grace, that curtain that only priests were allowed to enter into and get behind, that curtain was ripped right in two. And Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, is purported to say, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in Luke, the writer of the Gospel says, Father, into your hands I place my spirit. It's interesting, though. In the Gospel of John, Jesus has different last words. His words are, "It is finished." And it is here that we leave you pondering just what exactly did Jesus mean? Did he mean his life was done? That he had been finished? Or did he mean his work was finished? That in dying he had shown us fully what a life that had been, as the gospel hymn says, emptied until all that was left was love? Or did he mean that this love that was so held in human vessels, so contained by the powers that be, was now being unleashed onto the world? That the piñata had been broken? That God's unconditional love was now being unleashed into the world, into you and I, and nothing, not even death on a cross, could stop, could finish it.